I'm really pleased to be able to introduce to you our next speaker, Garrett Schemmel, who's going to talk to us about building a better data business. Garrett currently runs a number of the data businesses at the company formerly known as Penton Media, now known as Penton. And I think that gives him a really interesting perspective to talk about this very big and important topic. I think what you're going to see is that he's got some interesting insights into a number of different application, business, pricing, and sales models. He's had now direct involvement with both software and data as a service products. I think he's going to show you that he's got a strong frontline understanding of what's involved in the transformation of legacy data products to keep them successful in today's demanding new environment. And he also brings to his work a really strong marketing background. So he's got insights into this whole burgeoning area of data-driven marketing. I think even more intriguing than that, Garrett is relatively new to Penton and even newer to its data products. So I think he's bringing to it a very fresh perspective that you'll see in his comments. And he draws that perspective from a background in a variety of really interesting and important areas like e-commerce, online marketing, and even industrial design. And I think what you're going to hear is some very important lessons about the data business, some interesting lessons learned, and I think you're going to get some deep insights into the data business and maybe some new, fresh ways to think about it that you can apply to your own business as well. So please join me in welcoming Garrett.
Sound good? Yep, we're mic'd up. As the second Penton guy today, I unfortunately don't have the one of the 8 reasons for being a 3/4 full guy like David had, where the one that really stuck out to me was hooking up is easier than ever. I can tell you guys that that's not on the internal Penton intranet site for sure. But thanks for having me, guys. And by the way, as we get started, we think of data businesses really having 4 major components, right? So you've got the sales team, the marketing team, you've got product, and you've got data or the analyst team. That's how we think about it. I'll talk today about the data end and the product end of this, right? So we'll not quite dive into sales and marketing where we've done a tremendous amount of work, and that's day-to-day the thing we control the most as a business in a large company. But ultimately, a quick shout out to Penton. So Penton, I think we just are calling ourselves this, but we're a professional information services company, right? Quite a few people in our database. Ultimately, we inform, engage, and advance. You could roughly think of Inform as connecting to the data end of our portfolio, while Engage is very event-centric, publication or content-centric, and Advance is really our marketing services group. That's a rough way to think about it, but we're pretty excited in my part of the world with insights as well as workflow tools. So what is Equipment Watch? So Equipment Watch is one of 2 brands I run. Both of them are equipment or vehicle data businesses. Simply put, you can think of us as the Kelley Blue Book for construction equipment, right? So we tell you pretty much any critical benchmark you could want to know about yellow iron, right? So bulldozers, excavators, all that stuff that we guys love to play with as kids. We deliver data through pretty much every medium possible right now. We have primarily through a web application. We have flat files in the government and insurance markets, APIs as well as print, although we're almost out of it. Talking specifically about the analyst end of our business, we have around 15 statisticians and accountants on staff, and we're based out of Atlanta. Okay? And David did mention that we have about 20, 25 offices around the country, so Atlanta is kind of the southern hub for the business. But ultimately, so I want to talk about the fact that we think of ourselves now. I remember going to David 2 years ago and presenting to him the first time after he joined and saying, David, you need to think about us as a SaaS business, right? And even more specifically as a data as a service business. Probably even 2 years ago, not very common in Penton. That impacted just about everything you can imagine, from the tools we need to the data to the marketing tools and databases that support us. So this message, I think the message of what I'm going to talk about today is really focused at those people in the room who are interested in the data and insights products, right? So we, as those kind of people and businesses, are all facing similar challenges, right? I remember hearing this, I think, on a Russell webinar. Commoditization pressures are encroaching, right? So If you're a pure data business, at some point, someday, somebody's going to figure out a slightly faster way to capture your data and is going to come after you. And speaking of customers specifically, they're going through a major digital transition, right? They're going through a major digital transition. Their needs are more complex and sophisticated than ever, and ultimately they're looking for efficiencies, right? We have a lot of government customers in our business, and they are not getting more money. So our goal is to help those folks figure out how to do their jobs faster, and ultimately, part of that process is figuring out how to get our data into their tool set. And so all of this, I think, is, really talking about 3/4 of a glass kind of people. I think we really are. I think we're on the edge of a great opportunity, right? And ultimately, all of our products have to evolve pretty quickly. But I mentioned earlier about thinking of yourself as a SaaS business, right? Software as a service business. That's an important mindset that you have to change. And in Penton, in the data products ends of the business, we're thinking of ourselves as on a continuum, right? So most of us, for the longest time, send somebody a flat file. We're 100% data business, data as a service business. On the far right side is all software, right? Very, very Silicon Valley centric. What's the 8th new task app that's going to come out today, right? So ultimately, somewhere in between is where you should be. We think of ourselves as somewhere about 90% data, 10% software right now. We're very heavily web app business. For us, there's opportunity in the enterprise data, in the flat file and API deliveries. But ultimately, we know that retention will be greatly impacted as a web app business by figuring out how to integrate more software. Software for us equals retention. And that's how we think about it, right? At some point, if we go too far, then we'll stop being the unbiased benchmark supplier, and we can end up being a software competitor to many in our space who we aspire to integrate with. So what you kind of figure out is kind of a homework element here is once you as a data product owner, figure out where you are on this continuum. There's 5 main things I'd like to talk to you about today, right? One is really understanding where are your customers in the data customer product life cycle, right? Secondly, don't be afraid of standardization and don't be afraid of becoming the standard and foundational data point for the industry. That may even require you going open source. Maybe you probably know about lean startups, lean product development. I think that goes well beyond product. That goes as well to data processes, just making fast decisions. Including the data processes, and ultimately, let's have a quick conversation about what may be some best practices for API creations and management as well as web app development. So here's how we think of the data customer product lifecycle, right? So ultimately, at the beginning, this is true for us. We're primarily a web app first business. You may be slightly different. But ultimately for us, customer will come on board. They see they can get to the web app first, takes no internal development. We onboard them there. We actually invest in some third-party software, Scout Analytics, that allows us to keep an eye on usability of each subscription. They're not the only ones anymore. We brought them on board almost 3 years ago, but basically Scout allows us to connect usage with contract data, and it puts into a very simple to read format. And using tools like Scout allows you to basically now, when companies can move to the next level, right? So our enterprise sales guys or strategic sellers basically use Scout to figure out when there's overutilization of an account, and that's when a conversation about batch processing or API integration starts. So what's batch processing? That's basically for the folks that really, really like APIs, the efficiencies they bring, but guess what? Their budget cycle isn't available to support an API integration, or whatever it may be, or maybe they just don't like it. So batch processing for us is when we take the efficiencies of an API, and we have APIs for just about every data point that we have now, and our analyst team does that processing locally, right? So batch processing is basically going to be, hey, you want us to append the current market price for all of your equipment? We can do that. Do you want to do that monthly, quarterly, annually? What do you want to do, right? And it's specifically for resource-constrained organizations. At some point, especially those organizations that are really web-centric, at some point, APIs allow efficiencies and obviously more features, right? So this is how we think on the strategic sell side for us. This is how we think of our customer lifecycle. The second major point is becoming foundational, right? So I'll give you an example in a second. But for us in the heavy equipment world, no one's really built a taxonomy that's standard. There's no ISO standard for construction equipment taxonomies or make model databases or anything like that. So there's opportunity there, right? We believe in productizing everything. This is a really big deal, a big message that we have to communicate to our CIO and our CDO, because you have to make sure that when any API or any functionality is built, that it be able to be consumed by ourselves as well as any customer. So there are internal APIs, there are external APIs, right? We set those expectations whenever an internal API is built. I talked about this already. Be prepared to give away taxonomies, right? And through creative packaging. So maybe you don't really give it away, but for us, it's appended as for use, licensed use with any API that's been bought. And all this, and of course, there are, so leads to much higher success rate of our products. What does that mean? Let me give you a specific example. So we partnered with the largest heavy equipment online marketplace in the world. They picked us to basically get exclusive right to give our values away. Right? They want to become known as the Kelley Blue Book of the heavy equipment world. Still lagging the auto world by at least 20 years in that regards. And so they started consuming our API. Well, guess what? We had like a 30% hit rate. Right? They had their make model database. They just thought there was a ton of ego and a ton of pride put in that puppy. Well, guess what? 30%, they weren't very happy, and they knew that they had a dirty database. But ultimately, we knew that the outcome of that relationship years into the contract would be a very unhappy customer. We had to make sure they got results. So we convinced them to use our make model database. We even built, in the interim, we built in fuzzy matching logic into the API so that we could get there incrementally, and we were successful. Number 3 is a lean culture. I hesitate to throw just product in there. I know there's a lot of product people in the room, but this should really impact not only your product expertise, but also your data collection process. So what does this mean? This means for us, it's any time that we see a manual process come around, for us, the team has been trained to figure out how to automate that. Part of that culturally is making sure that you figure out what is failure, right? So if this is a product conversation, we want to make sure that we use tools that allow us to underinvest in a product, and I think that's a hard message for a lot of CIOs. Is especially for us, right? We're a business unit has to fight for resources. Anytime product development comes about, we want the sucker to be a Cadillac, right? Anything that comes out of Penn has to be a Ferrari. Well, that's not always the case, right? And David mentioned today we're working on changing that culture. We've made a lot of headway. Another way to think that is make sure that the investment matches the risk and awareness, right? So let me give you a very specific example. So this summer we went to a trade show. It's called Farm Progress. It's the biggest outdoor ag show in the country, right? It's a Penton show as well. For us, we have a new valuation product focused on ag equipment. It was on the list of things to do with development. We just couldn't quite get there, and we saw that as a pain point. So what do? There's this really cool tool that we're actually adopting like crazy right now. It's called Sheet Labs, right? So Sheet Labs is it takes responsibility for API management, and it gives it to the analysts on staff. So it gives you the ability to take an Excel file or a CSV file, go through a simple drag and drop interface online, add it, create an API, and there's built-in API management. There's authorization, all this really cool stuff, right? And so we built an API in about 3 minutes. The analyst just had to create the Excel file, hired a developer in about 2 weeks, did a quick mock-up, used off-the-shelf Twitter Bootstrap themes from ThemeForce.net, and we built a fully functioning responsive app for about $2,000 in 2 weeks. So really cool. Obviously, in a large company like ours, we have prepared with the message that this sucker is going to get thrown away, right? There's no central authorization connected to it. We onboard people. We use stormpath.com to control access to this thing, which is authorization as an API. So really cool stuff. And so all of this was done really quick. And this is us making sure that we don't ask for an investment that's out of proportion, right? All right, so we'll dive into our data collection process as well, right? we as a business, what is data for us? Data is a few different types. It's all based on equipment. So for a Bobcat T190 skid steer, for example, we will collect cost data, right? That's cost data for us is going to be maintenance notes. It's going to be how much I put into a piece of equipment over time directly from an end user. But really the biggest type of data that we collect is about 500,000 assets a month that we collect from over 100 marketplaces online. Primarily web extraction these days, but also we get directly sourced data, and that those are old relationships. But generally speaking, we now prefer web extraction. So if somebody even comes to us and says, here's a CSV file of our auction results, we say this is great, right? We take them, but we still continue the web extraction because we've built in some cleaning processes through that process. So like I mentioned, automate as much as possible, and this is a data team culture thing, right? And so when I've been running Equipment Watch for almost 3 years now. It used to be in San Jose, California, and the very first thing my boss did was he shut down that office. It was by itself, tiny little office, and we moved it to Atlanta. When we did that, we took the opportunity to move it from an editor to an analyst culture, right? And I think for a lot of people in the B2B information space, editor means data entry. So it became really important for us to bring people on board that could really analyze the data and tell stories, and that was an important part, right? So what we've done, there's a tremendous amount of examples, and I'll give you one in a second, about how we've saved a lot of time, but with that extra time, we have to get to being an insights business, right? We have to get, and by the way, insights for us right now means content marketing, right? We put out 18 pieces of intelligence and insights a year, and it's content marketing. We'll be the first to say it. But it's led to a lot more higher value opportunities. And the big thing is you should always be able to know what your data acquisition costs. There are three major points in the data process. There's your collection cost, there's your cleaning cost, and then there's your, if you have to do it manually, there's your upload or input cost, right? Know what those costs are. We always maintain a list of third-party APIs and open data sources. For us, that's kind of like kids in a candy shop, right? We love to know what's possible. And ultimately, where possible, we do believe in web extraction and Mechanical Turk as a competency. All kinds of reasons, not just just saving costs, but sometimes, for example, with web extraction specifically, maybe there's some blend of an API that you need for some specific purpose, and in a large matrix organization like ours, getting engineering resources aren't always simple. So sometimes, even last week, right, we went and we used web extraction on our core application, equipmentwatch.com, and we built an API to Sheetlab so that the analyst team could do something specific that they needed to do. So that kind of thing couldn't happen 6 months ago, right? So let me dive real quick. Who knows what Mechanical Turk is? Oh man, we'll go quick through that process then. All right, so web extraction, right? So a lot of tools out there. I know Connotate's in the house. We've got Kapow software. You've got Mazenda. And then there's a lot of new free tools out there that are really, really freaking cool. Not quite as complex, but you've got Import.io, which has showed up. They've got a lot of attention from the SaaS startup space. You've got Kimono Labs, right, which is this tool that lets you essentially, it's web extraction, but instead of this start-stop process, it turns whatever source site into a real-time API. So, and even that's revolutionary for the web extraction world. Is real-time web extraction. So why should you do web extraction? For us, it's about automation. It's about automation all the time. Initially, it's about cost control, but that obviously peters out pretty quick. Would absolutely recommend you establish corporate guidelines if you're in a larger corporation. It's the very first thing that we had to do. And ultimately, I gave you guys an example of a very specific creative way to use web extraction. Once it becomes a competency, there's just tons of ways to use it. Mechanical Turk, all right? So web extraction, if you're really honest, it's not completely unstructured data, right? Maybe if you have a more complex web extraction provider, you're going to be doing some pretty cool stuff, but ultimately it's still pretty structured stuff. It's not like you're trying to scrape directly a PDF or something like that. But when things are crazy, right, when there's no way that web extraction will work, we're big advocates for Mechanical Turk, which is a network of about 300,000 human beings willing to do micro tasks. We only use U.S.-based Turkers, and we had to learn that over about a 4 to 5 month process. Right, we started in October 2013, and I would say our process for translation using Mechanical Turk took about 4 or 5 months. So by about April this year. But they're still human beings, right? So we actually charge more like, or we pay more like 7.5 cents per task. 2.5 cents is about minimum. And this is all about knowing what your actual cost of a data point is. And the coolest thing is, since you're dealing with human beings, these folks are going to want to work for you, right? We get emails come Sunday night. People want to know, is work coming out Monday? So let me give you a really specific example of how we used it in that process that we figured out earlier this year. For us, one of the least fun things for a statistician with a master's degree to ever want to do is to translate PDFs, right? So, and then if you, for us, we tried building a small team that does that manually locally, but there was just a huge cultural issue. So what we ended up working on after many attempts is going the route of Mechanical Turk. So all the classic reasons, right? Translating specs is hard, right? It could be on a website. It could be in a PDF. And by the way, what are specs for heavy equipment? What's the length, the width, the height, the weight? What's the capacity of the bucket? What's the horsepower? Who makes the engine? All that kind of stuff, right? Very critical stuff. So ultimately, we need a new solution. So here's what we did. Very specifically, this is the process. So try to shave off all the manual aspect that we can. Web extraction is still a competency that we use to collect the URLs to online specifications. That can be an HTML web page, or that can be a PDF. Then basically we built some custom HTML that allows us to take those links and go, and inside Mechanical Turk we have basically an interface where for an equipment type at a time, for one model inside one equipment type at a time, we go through this process. So it takes, for us, there's a sweet spot of about 100 models a week that we can translate reliably, and we translate all data points at one time, right? So this costs us somewhere about $1 a model to do, right, in real time. Another big benefit, by the way, of using Mechanical Turk is doing work in duplicate and triplicate. It's really, you should only do in triplicate or more, right? Or else you won't know if there's two different answers, you won't know who's to pick. Everything comes out of Mechanical Turk at the end of a work week. We have weekly cycles, and then we have custom macros we build offline, finds all the matches that are right, and then ultimately a human being handles the exceptions, which are probably somewhere around 5 to 10%, right? And so it's been a ton of success, and I'm glad we did it. So what were the results? Ultimately, we reduced specs translation costs by about 75%. And by the way, we're doing work in triplicate now instead of only one person translating specifications. Really big deal. Okay. And obviously reliability went up considerably. All right, the fifth major point from a data project strategy standpoint is going to be, let's talk about APIs, right? We are an API business that sells content through our API. Hopefully everybody understands that we're on a major growth trend, right? So API should be easier and easier every day, every month to create and maintain. Depending on how you do it, right? If this is an enterprise level API that you want your customers to consume, something that we haven't gotten to that far with Sheet Labs yet, it's going to take time to implement. And the funny thing about APIs is again, for a larger organization, the development team does not, especially for us, does not sit within the business. So when you're selling an API, and this is really important, when you're selling an API, you're going to need more tech expertise. So for us, when there's an API conversation going on, either I sit in on the call, or our product manager does, right? Who has that level of detailed knowledge to handle major vetting questions at the beginning. Would I love if we had more resources from engineering to some of those calls? I would, but for those in larger organizations, you're going to have tech experience on the business team. And API management is a must, right? So API management allows the business to keep an eye on usage and bill appropriately. Big believers in billing on a per call basis, right? So depending on how much your data is worth, I know in the B2C world, you're talking about, thousands of a cent for call. In our world, you're talking about 100 to 1,000 times more than that. Okay. I've already talked about internal usage, and this is a framework. I'm stealing this from a video that 3Scale did. 3Scale.net, who's an API management provider, but really cool way of thinking about of APIs. Is your API a product unto itself? I mean, I love this idea of doing some web extraction for some niche need, going to Sheet Labs, turning into basically building some kind of API management controlled API, putting up a WordPress site, having like an API as a product business in like a day. That's just really cool, right? And then obviously the promotion and projection of the product is more like Amazon and Salesforce. And then for Twitter, you've got an API that powers and feeds the product. So this is where we are, by the way, with web app strategy. We've been working on a new web app for quite some time, and you'll be seeing that early next year. But that's really where your software strategy comes into play, right? It's the workflow tools that are integrated into your web application that can impact retention. And for us, we'll be splitting our marketing app from our data app. Okay? Those are all the major ones. I think I'm out of time.